Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Alcandros International Trading Podcast. I'm your host, Constantine Kai Alcandros. Welcome to another educational podcast. Today, we're going to be covering aluminium scrap. Aluminium scrap comes in a couple of forms. One is aluminium 6063, which is also known as aluminium extrusion scrap. So that is aluminium scrap that's made up from usually odds and ends or different parts of different products that were once either part of a product or were aluminium products beforehand, and then as they aged and kind of broke down, they've then been taken and used for scrap. Some of it comes from, I believe, air conditioning. I'm sure there's other parts that come from stripped aircraft, vehicles, aluminium that comes probably from machinery as well, probably from a variety of different places, and then is bought up by scrap dealers and then sold, and then it's used and recycled to make new aluminium. So you've got 6063, which is extrusion, and you can generally find that either in sheet form or in sort of like metal sheet strips. Not necessary sort of like proper sheets like copper cathode. And like copper millberry, it's pressed into square blocks for easier transportation and easier storage. There's also alloy, and then there's also aluminium alloy scrap, which is car wheel scrap. So all aluminium alloys are from the cars, car wheels that get recycled. So you've got your aluminium extrusion 6063 and aluminium alloy as well. Of course, the aluminium comes in is of sort of variety of different types and qualities. Of course, you got your grade A and grade B, as we discussed, sort of mentioned before in copper. Grade A and grade B. There's an obvious distinction and difference there. Grade A being better quality and more expensive. Grade B being of lesser quality and less expensive. So those are your two types of aluminium scrap that are available on the market. Now, the uses for those, of course, as I've said before, they get basically broken down, and then once they get broken down and recycled, they're made anew and then used again to make products, whether it be aircraft, car parts, air conditioners, refrigerators, whatever. That's generally what happens. And so scrap dealers, import exporters who deal with scrap will then, buy it and then on-sell it to people who will then turn it into some sort of product. And there's not much to say. I don't want to say there's not much to say, but I sort of don't want to kind of repeat myself too much, because aluminium is essentially like copper. Basically, the way the copper market works is exactly the way the aluminium market works, albeit it's somewhat different because it is a different product. But it's essentially the same thing. And usually you'll find most or a lot of metal scrap dealers who deal in copper will deal with aluminium, or vice versa. People who deal with aluminium will deal with copper. So generally, scrap dealers or scrap exporters or scrap traders will deal with both copper and aluminium. So maybe let's look at sort of the geography. Aluminium is not as, although it is a more common metal than copper, the global availability is, although I'm sure it's wide, it's probably not as, probably is as wide, if not more wide than copper, but the demand is not because the demand for copper isn't as because the demand for aluminium isn't as high as copper, there doesn't appear to be as many, I guess, suppliers, you could say, in comparison to copper, or at least there doesn't seem to be sort of a lot of different areas where there's a supply of aluminium. I'm sure there are, but you just don't, because you don't see a lot of demand for aluminium. There doesn't tend to be a lot of knowledge about, where a lot of aluminium can be found. And, I mean, having dealt with copper, selling it, and helping others sell theirs, you sort of know where the copper is, whereas aluminium, not so much demand for it, so not as wide. I can't really give you as wide a scope as to where you can find aluminium in particular. I'm sure there is some some aluminium scrap suppliers in the U.S. I do know for a fact that there is some in Brazil. There is a supplier there, so there's definitely some in South America. Africa as well, particularly South Africa. Some in Europe, and Germany in particular. Germany is definitely a known supplier, or at least there is a presence of suppliers there that can supply aluminium scrap. The rest of it seems to be a little bit sort of sporadically spread out, either between sort of Russia, the UAE, and Malaysia, and South Korea. So there is some, of course, in Australia and New Zealand, but again, it's not really very often exported, if at all. So not as great a spread as copper. Like I said, although it's abundant, although it's an abundant metal, more abundant than copper. There's not as much demand for it. I'm not sure why that is. Perhaps because copper, there's more demand for copper, but I don't think that's the case. I think copper is in high demand because it's a better. I think probably the way to explain it would be probably due to the fact that copper is more valuable in terms that it's a better conductor of electricity than aluminium. That that would increase the demand and value for copper, whereas aluminium, because it's not used as a conductor of electricity as often as copper, there isn't as much demand for aluminium, and so therefore you don't see a lot of not just demand, but also the pricing of aluminium is cheaper than copper, so that keeps the price of aluminium down. So there's an abundance of aluminium on Earth. It's used more in sort of fabrication and manufacturing, not in electronics, whereas copper is used more widely in other things than just telecommunications and automobiles. It's used everywhere. Not the case with aluminium. Although it is everywhere and used everywhere, it's only in sort of specific things like manufacturing of products and nothing else. It also does have to compete with plastic as well. Plastic is used a lot, and rubber to make products, and there's now carbon fiber. So aluminium, although it is in demand, it's not as much as it's not in as much demand as copper is. Now, that still doesn't mean the price is high. Aluminium still is an expensive product, and we'll look at the price a little bit later on. What I'll do is kind of just give a general rundown on, I might just sort of give a kind of a general idea or a definition about what aluminium is. I think that's a good thing to know, is to understand what the actual product itself is. If I can just get myself a scientific definition. So yeah, having a few issues with the internet here, so it's really got me pretty angry. So just bear with me a moment. So I'm just using my tablet here. Yes, I'm not sure why, but it's just, it's really starting to piss me off now. So, yeah. Sometimes I bang things. For some reason, it helps. It appears not to be doing anything. So, of all the times for this to not work, it has to not work in the middle of my podcast. Okay, well, what I'll do is show you. Well, basically, it's a metal, and it's the most abundant metal on the Earth. I can't exactly give you a scientific breakdown of the metal, not off the top of my head at least. So, okay, so maybe we've got the internet coming back now. Okay, so aluminium is a chemical element with the symbol Ai and atomic number 13. It is a silvery white, soft, non-magnetic, inductile metal in the boron group. By mass, aluminium makes up about 8% of the Earth's crust, where it is the third most abundant metal element and almost the most abundant metal. So, all right, it's not quite the most, but it's one of the sort of top, and probably one of the top, if not the top, at least in the top 2 or 3. So let's take a look at. I'll show you some photos of what I'm referring to here. So bear with me, I'm going to probably have to scroll down a fair bit to get there. Okay, so here we go. As you can see, Hong Kong, I forgot it's another place as well that that aluminium is sourced from. So that is some sort of, that's sort of an example of extrusion when it's pressed down. So it looks like that. And there's some wire there. That's more there. So just ignore that. There's some more extrusion here. So sometimes it's in sheets, and sometimes it's in these like strips of. You can see it's sort of like in strips of aluminium. So these are all sort of scrap parts that have been collected. More there. All right. So that's an example of what aluminium does look like. Aluminium is generally not supplied in very large quantities, believe it or not. Although there is some demand for it, there isn't a huge amount of supply. So, copper millbury, you can get suppliers who can supply in the tens of thousands per month. Aluminium, not as much, so not as great. That might be because the demand for aluminium isn't as great anywhere, and not just as great, not anywhere near as great as copper. So there might be, so suppliers may not keep as much stocked up. In terms of the other thing to mention with aluminium is also purity. So like copper, the higher the purity, the better. The lower the purity, the not necessarily that it's complete trash, but the lesser grades won't be as used for certain things as others will be used. So lower grade aluminium you might use to make cheap products with. The way that I'll get to the price in a second. I'm just going to get this ready. As you can see, this is the LME site. But in terms of payment terms, in terms of like minimum order quantities, you're usually looking at. You may find some suppliers who I come across who might do sort of like a container. Generally, though, with metals, you're looking in 5,000 metric tons or more to get a deal done. So you're going to need to buy volume to get aluminium. The payment terms, payment terms, I've covered this in other podcasts. I won't cover them again. It's the same for most if not all products. So I won't cover that in terms of aluminium. If you go to the LME side, as we covered in the previous podcast on copper, the price of aluminium is based off the LME. So currently, as you can see right now, it is sitting at $1,662.50 US per ton. So quite high, albeit I don't think there's been too big. There hasn't been a huge spike on aluminium as copper has undertaken, but yeah, 1,662 now for suppliers. Generally, if you can do a 10% discount on quantity, you'd be looking at 1,500. The market for aluminium is definitely very wide. It's not as as I said in the last podcast about copper. Copper has although at times it does have a fairly wide. There is a wide gap between buyers and suppliers on price. There is some kind of overlap at times, whereas aluminium, I would say in my experience, there's almost no overlap between pricing. The suppliers are all on one side, and the buyers are all on the other end. So most buyers, if well, not all buyers I've come across, they just quote ridiculous prices, half the cost of the LME price. So the market doesn't want to pay the market price close to 1,600. They want to try and get it from cheaper wholesalers. Which to some degree they can do it of course they have to go to the country. They'll have to go travel to that country and get it. Again, this is similar to copper, as I mentioned before. They'll get it more cheaply, but then it'll cost them more to ship it. So generally, suppliers that sell that cheap don't have that much quantity. So I have seen suppliers out there now, whether they're legitimate or not, selling aluminium for anywhere between sort of $600 to $800 a metric ton. It's probably not. Like I said, if they're not scammers, they're most likely local or not international, but national wholesalers. So these are not people that may necessarily be export accredited, or if they are, they don't have a great quantity, or they'll make you come and buy it in person. But generally, there's a big divide between buyers and suppliers, and very rarely is it a product that you see any kind of possibility of doing business with. It's been a while since we've done anything with aluminium. The last, I'd say probably around mid-2000 or early 2018 was the last time that we had a buyer that we dealt with for aluminium. Since then, there's really been there hasn't been any buyer that we've even kind of gone into any kind of deep discussion about aluminium with. So aluminium is not a product that's in great demand. It is in demand, but not in great demand, and the market is divided. There's not a lot of middle ground. There's basically no middle ground on aluminium. So it's a product that, right now, from my experience, I feel like there's not a lot of it's not it's not a great product. It's one that really is not one that we're getting anything out of or getting anything on at the moment. There's not a lot of activity on aluminium. It hasn't been since, like I said, probably mid-2018. So we're getting on to about 2 years now. So it's a product that's not very there's not much happening with, let's say, in our portfolio right now. So maybe that will change, but currently, as it sits, that's how it is. So prices are high, demand is and demand is not that high either, and so that's probably why the market probably thinks it can get a better price. I think it thinks it can get a good price because there's maybe not as much demand, although obviously there is, but not in comparison to copper. So Um, I'd say global demand for aluminium varies. From really my experience, most of the leads that or inquiries that we've dealt with, or buyers that we've dealt with or supplied, have come from India. That India seems to be the country that has the greatest demand for aluminium, and this is probably due to the fact that aluminium is cheaper than copper, and more abundant than any other metal, and probably also due to the fact that they have a growing car industry there as well. So there's probably the reason why they're the biggest importers of aluminium. I'd say really after India, from my experience, I'd say South Korea. There does seem to be some interest coming out of South Korea for aluminium, but not quite as much as India. So I'd say India really is the only country where there's any kind of demand for aluminium right now at this point. So as I said, that of course could change over in time, but that's sort of how things stand at the moment. I'd say that's it for today's podcast on aluminium. I'm not sure there's much more I can add to it. So if there is anything I can add to it, I'll make a separate podcast a sort of follow up to this podcast. On behalf of course, if you want to contact us either about the product that we're talking about today, or just any other inquiries you have about either our trading company or our products, or you want to do business with us, then of course you can contact us through Facebook, through Messenger, and WhatsApp. On behalf of Alcandros International Trading, this is Konstantin Kai Alcandros signing out.